So it's early 2021 in lockdown UK, and people are starting to make tentative plans for the rest of the year. And one of the things that's been suggested in my club is a couple of really fun group hobby projects. Things that might turn into events one day when this is all over, or might just stay as fun individual projects. One of these is the idea of playing an old hammer Warhammer Fantasy Battle campaign, using the rules from the 5th edition Battle Book. Okay, so technically that's Middle Hammer, but the book included rules for this territory-based campaign with restricted armies, and it looks really fun. Also, restricted armies means we won't have to build anything too huge. In this video, I'm going to look through that campaign and see how that might work. 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles was released in 1996, and it was the second big box set version of Warhammer. The first, in 1992, featured single-pose high elves and goblins, and some very nostalgic cardboard cutouts for the bigger models, but the box we're talking about featured two totally new ranges of plastic models, Bretonnians and Lizardmen. This was released when I was halfway through secondary school, and I remember playing it every weekend at friends' houses. This is the version of Warhammer I've probably played the most. If you've never played Warhammer Fantasy Battle, it was very different from modern Age of Sigmar. Units were organised into ranked blocks and had to wheel and manoeuvre around to try and line up the best charge. The comparative power of individual models was sometimes less important than how many ranks you had or weight of numbers. Morale was an important part of armies, and magic item cards and spell cards were everywhere. I played it loads, but as a big group of teenagers, I don't think we often finished a game. Setup took a lot longer than AOS. The Battle Book was the other book in the box set, the one that wasn't the rule book, and it contained the usual introduction to the hobby, a bit of background on each of the factions and common monsters, and some basic tournament and campaign rules. The first of these was just for linking the battles you play against your regular gaming buddy, but we're looking at this. Multiplayer campaigns. In this campaign, each player starts with a severely restricted force. In Warhammer Fantasy Battle, army organisation was done by percentage. Your army had to include a minimum of 25% of its points spent on normal units, and couldn't have more than, say, 50% of its points spent on characters, or 25% on war machines, or whatever. The exact numbers varied slightly by army. This campaign restricted this even further, allowing the following. A single level 1 wizard, a general, and no other character models. One magic item worth up to 50 points, which was like low to mid power for a magic item back then. One war machine or chariot, one large monster, and no allies. That's a lot of restrictions, so games were intended to be played at the relatively small 1500 point level. Unfortunately, it's also more restrictive for some armies than others. Undead tended to want a few wizards around to make the army work, and demons paid a premium for spells that in this they might not be able to use. Anyway, these restrictions are lifted by the territory table. Each player at the start of the campaign generates 3 territories from the table. Most of the territories allow you to include in your army extra choices: champions, wizards, magic items, or monsters. They're not free, you have to fit them into those 1500 points, but at least you have the option. Other territories add a small number of extra points to your army, and there are a few special territories like the Ruins, which gave you a random free magic item, or the Spy, which allows you to disrupt your enemy's plans by poisoning his general or stealing the order of battle and allowing your troops to get into better positions. Again, these are more useful to some armies than others, but having a useless territory just gives you an easy pick when it comes to staking. Players organise their own games in the campaign, and in each game, both players stake a territory, representing the border where their lands meet, and then they generate a third. The winner of the game keeps their territory, but then can choose to either take their opponent's territory or take the spare one. The loser just gets whatever's left over. They also encourage you to try and theme the battlefield to the territories being thought over, but back then, with no plastic kits available, I think you'd probably be playing over the same field every time. You can see how this is a clever thing to include in a starter set. If, like me, you were a school kid at the time and mostly played at the weekend, this is the sort of thing that encourages you to spend your weekly pocket money on, say, a new champion model to make use of that village you just won. I guess it's also useful for an established club, which might already have a selection of terrain and where everyone has more than the basic 1500 points to pick from. It's a fun little system, allowing armies to be very slightly unbalanced, but probably not in a way that massively affects the game. If you do end up with a mismatch, the underdogs rule protects players who only have half as many territories as their opponent by setting the points limit either at 1000 points or whatever the smallest player has, and allows the smaller player to pick which of the enemy territories he wants to fight for. Finally, the system encourages players to team up. We know allies aren't allowed, but you're allowed to invite other players to be your ally, and they get to bring along 500 points of their own army with all their own restrictions. Your opponent doesn't get anything to balance this out, so they then have to go and find an ally of their own. And that's it. Short and sweet, but probably with quite a lot of variation in it. The current idea is to try and run this at the end of the year as a weekend-long event, which brings up some interesting things. I think we'll all have to paint some extra models to account for the gains as the campaign goes on, and maybe prep some really versatile lists that we can quickly reassemble. But as long as we keep the points down, I imagine it'll be okay. I'm also considering a Tale of Four Gamers style series for this, depending on who fancies doing their hobby progress on a Zoom call. Let's see what happens. Until then, thanks for watching.